All right. Good day, everybody. Just wait a few minutes to let people appear. Good day, good day. If you're in the chat, please say hello. Hello, Hannah. Hope you're having a nice day. Hello, Aaron. Hello, Jacob. All right, just a couple minutes and then we'll get started. Hello, Miss Barry. All right. So, second last day of the course. I don't know who North American treasures are. If you could identify yourself by name, I'd greatly appreciate it. Hello, Aiden. So we are at the second last day of the course, and I had just seen on the news that apparently there's a new announcement regarding education supposed to be forthcoming in the next little bit. So hopefully either today or tomorrow. So keep your eyes on the Twitters or on the news wherever you consume it. We'll see what it all means. If it's safe to do so, I think it would be great if we could all get back in time for the beginning of Quad 3. That being said, we shall see what comes, right? This is very much out of our hands, so we need to be patient with ourselves. So just asking again, whoever it is that's in the account called North American Treasures, if you could please identify who you are, or if you're logging out and logging back in under your school account, then that's all the better. Okay. So as far as today's work goes, obviously the ISU is due tomorrow, preferably earlier in the day than later in the day. I have report cards that I need to complete by Monday. So the hard and fast of tomorrow isn't really there per se. It's not like I have to hit submit on report cards at 4 p.m. tomorrow. That being said, enjoy. I want you to have your weekend. So, prioritize, okay? So, if you're in the college pathway, expecting a 5-paragraph essay submitted tomorrow, I'm expecting a PowerPoint explaining some things about the traits, getting some images about the person, as well as answering the question about the award. That's the one part of the PowerPoint that people seem to be missing. But overall, I get the feeling that everybody is going to finish up strong. Most people have been getting in touch and have been explaining what's going on. Hello, Cameron. So please, please, please keep at it, okay? That's the most important thing, is just to keep at it. Of course, you can use Google Slides. I have no concerns about what platform you use as long as I get a visual presentation of some sort, okay? So when it comes to today's work, what you have is a important story that's going on in our country today. So if I'm going to switch over to Google Classroom, I'm going to lose the chat here for a second. Okay, we have this section here. So it says submit short story work here. That's from the pond story from the previous 2 days, right? So you have some space there to submit it if you haven't submitted it to me through other means. You have your ISU, and you also have this murdered, missing, and Indigenous women section, okay? So we're going to go through some of this together. We're not going to sit here and watch a 35-minute video and an hour-long video together, okay? But we are going to look through these other pieces, okay? So here's the first one, is this link right here, okay? So let's try to zoom out a little bit so you can actually see the whole thing, okay? So dispelling common myths about Indigenous peoples, 9 myths and realities. This is a very interesting document that goes about some of the stereotypes that exist in Canada around the First Nations people that exist. So I'm going to read the title of each myth, but I want you guys to just mainly focus on number 9, okay? So myth number 1, Indigenous peoples are all the same. I think we've done a good job in the course talking about how people come from different backgrounds, different geographies, different language traditions, and so on. Okay. Myth number 2, Indigenous people already have ample reserve lands and resources. We've talked a fair bit about issues around water. In fact, there's a water lawsuit that's taking place in our own area up in Curve Lake that's just starting up right now. Number 3, Indigenous peoples can do whatever they want with their reserved lands and resources. We've talked about how a lot of the money is tied up in trusts that is complicated to access. Number 4, Indigenous people living on reserves get free housing. That is certainly not the case, and it is far more complex than that. Number 5, Indigenous peoples don't pay taxes in Canada. There are some taxes that Indigenous people are exempt from because of the treaty negotiations that they've gone through, but they have other mechanisms and other means in which they are doing and contributing to that. Indigenous peoples receive free post-secondary education, right? There is certainly some equitable mechanisms that exist to help people out, but free is not the way to describe it. Residential schools are ancient history. We've talked a lot about 1996. We've talked a lot about how there's multiple generations and intergenerational trauma that's been going on. 8, there's no connection between Indigenous unemployment and Indigenous health and social problems. There certainly is. And here's the biggest one that we're talking about today. Missing and murdered Indigenous women brought it upon themselves. So I'm going to read this portion out completely, just so that you can get a sense of exactly what issue it is that's going on. So the reality. Decades of government policies have wreaked havoc on traditional Indigenous family relations and destroyed communities, leaving many Indigenous women and girls impoverished, demoralized, and extremely vulnerable to exploitation and attack. Prevailing antagonism and enduring racial stereotypes that sexualize Indigenous women and girls denigrate their dignity and self-worth, and sets the environment for some men to feel like they can get away with violent acts and hatred against them. StatsCan report, that's the statistics of the government, Violent victimization of Aboriginal women in the Canadian provinces, 2009. So we're talking about 10 years ago, shows that close to 67,000 or 13% of all Aboriginal women aged 15 and older living in the provinces stated that they had been violently victimized. Overall, Aboriginal women reported experiencing close to 138,000 incidents of violence and were almost 3 times more likely than non-Aboriginal women to report having been a victim of a violent crime. This was true regardless if the violence occurred between strangers or acquaintances or within a spousal relationship. Oops, excuse me. Scrolled too far. So, the reality, in 2014, the RCMP, that's the Mounties, released a report that marked the first time that police in Canada have attempted at a national level to identify how many Indigenous women and girls have been murdered or gone missing. So they hadn't even really been tracking it until 2014. So think about that for a second, right? Do you think that would happen in any other community in Canada? Do you think that would happen on the Toronto, group or the Ontario group or whatever? But they actually hadn't even been specifically looking at it in a national way until 6-7 years ago. According to the report, 1,017 women and girls identified as Indigenous were murdered between 1980 and 2012, a homicide rate roughly 4.5 times higher than that of all other women in Canada. In addition, as of November 2013, at least 164 Indigenous women and girls remained missing under suspicious circumstances or for undetermined reasons. Indigenous women and girls in Canada, on and off reserve, in major cities, in every region of the country, are at risk of experiencing violence. The perpetrators include Indigenous and non-Indigenous men alike. The 1,107 murdered Indigenous women and the additional 164 who are missing under suspicious circumstances did not bring it upon themselves. And so you've got a situation where just because, good morning, Nolan. Good morning, Mr. Begg. Just because of who these people are and who they were born, they are at an increased risk. Just like when we were looking at some of the anti-racism stuff at the beginning of the year, where you were talking about the guy who had been pulled over, who had done absolutely nothing wrong other than driving their in-laws' car that had expired license plate tags. Because he's a black man being pulled over in a car stop in the United States, he is at an increased risk of likely misfortune because of the circumstances that have surrounded and plagued the systemic racist nature of their system. In our system, if you are a Indigenous woman or Indigenous girl, until 6 or 7 years ago, they weren't even thinking about it as a category that needed attention on a national level. Can you imagine that there would ever be a situation where they were not looking at the murder rate of white women nationally in Canada? Probably never. They always were doing it, right? Because that's the overculture. That's what is seen to be as the standard. And that is the definition of systemic racism. And so when it comes to murdered and missing Indigenous women, we need to be much more engaged and think about where these gaps exist. So looking at this article, which is the Trudeau government. So we're talking about very recently, article June 3rd, 2020. The Trudeau government given failing grade for lack of action plan on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So, reading. It was Sonia Nadine May Sinwick's 31st birthday when she went missing in Ontario in mid-August 1994. She was with child, pregnant. She'd been planning to celebrate her birthday by meeting her sister, Maggie, at a Toronto Blue Jays game, but she never showed up. 11 days later, her body was found at the South Wold Earthworks National Historical Site, south of London, Ontario, wearing only a t-shirt and socks. Her cause of death was described as blunt force trauma. Obviously, my grief and the anxiety of never knowing what happened in the final moments of Sonia's life have haunted me, Sinwick said Wednesday. She expressed her disappointment that the massive 3-year effort of the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls has not led to change. Family, communities, and allies have not received any information about what governments, either federal or provincial, have been doing over the past year on this file, she said. I can tell you that, whatever it is, it has had little or no impact on the families left behind. It has brought us no solace, and it has not changed the violence we witness or the genocide we survive. The inquiry delivered its final report on June 3, 2019, concluding that decades of systemic racism and human rights violation had contributed to the deaths and disappearances of hundreds of Indigenous women and girls, and that it constituted a genocide. In the report card released Wednesday to mark the anniversary of that final report's release, the Native Women's Association of Canada found little has been done to address the inquiry's 231 calls for justice in the last 12 months. It awarded the federal government a resounding fail in the four broad categories of human rights, under which the inquiry made recommendations: health, security, culture, and justice. Instead of a national action plan, we are left with a lack of action plan, said Association President Lorraine Whitman. The sad fact is, we cannot afford to do nothing in the face of the violence that continues to take the lives of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women. Last week, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett said Ottawa is delaying its intended release of the National Action Plan this month because of COVID-19 pandemic. Whitman said using the pandemic as an excuse for not delivering a plan is a double slap to the face to Indigenous women who are facing even greater risks of violence because of isolation measures aimed at slowing the spread of the novel coronavirus. There are things that I've been trying to tell the government, but they have not been doing much listening, Whitman said. On Wednesday, Bennett acknowledged these concerns, but also said a national action plan is not just to Ottawa's to craft. It must involve commitments and reforms within provinces and territories, something that was highlighted in the inquiry's final report. Some people think that this was a federal inquiry. It was the first ever national public inquiry, so it requires that kind of intergovernmental work that is never easy, shall we say, Bennett said on an interview Wednesday. The Commission report insisted the response be regionally relevant. We will work with the provinces and territories in order to get the best possible national action plan we can. In a joint statement Wednesday, the National Inquiry's four commissioners said they deplore inaction on the part of some governments. As the final report asserts, the calls for justice are not mere recommendations or a quaint list of best practices. They are legal imperatives rooted in Canada's obligation under international and domestic human rights norms and laws. Chief Commissioner Marion Buehler is among many calling for transparency. I would like to see all governments, not just federal government, be transparent about what they've done to date and what they plan on doing moving ahead. I think that Canadians deserve that transparency, Buehler told the Canadian press earlier this week. Bennett would not commit to a timeline, but she did point to a federal website launched Wednesday that lists what she calls concrete actions taken across federal departments to date on addressing some of the issues identified by the inquiry. Those initiatives include legislation to preserve Indigenous languages, legislation to give Indigenous communities more control over their own child welfare systems, and the elimination of the gender discrimination in the Indian Act. The inquiry commissioners are also calling on the federal government to establish an ombudsperson and tribunal, one of the recommendations to ensure oversight into government's work on the implementation of calls for justice, and to ensure full participation of family and survivors. Bennett said that this will require provinces and territories to agree to an independent office having jurisdiction within their respective governments, which was also needed for national inquiry. But she didn't rule it out, saying that this is something that would be discussed. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh called it completely wrong that a year has passed and Ottawa has not yet completed a national action plan. The government doesn't need to plan this out to find the best time to do it, he said. Bennett committed to continue working with all partners, pointing to a need to establish indicators and metrics to ensure progress. I'm very optimistic that we will not let these families and survivors down. We will get this done, and we will continue to work across all government departments to keep going. So, despite the fact that everybody has said this is messed up, like really messed up, we still haven't seen any action. Okay? So you've got another article here that I'm just going to quickly read this selection to you. All right. So it's called Seven Fallen Feathers. In 1966, 12-year-old Cheney Winjack froze to death on the railway tracks after running away from residential school. An inquest was called and 4 recommendations were made to prevent another tragedy. None of those recommendations were applied. More than a quarter of a century later, from 2000 to 2011, 7 Indigenous high school students in Thunder Bay, Ontario, died in Thunder Bay, Ontario. The 7 were hundreds of miles away from their families, forced to leave home and to live in a foreign and unwelcoming city. 5 were found dead in the rivers surrounding Lake Superior, below a sacred Indigenous site. Jordan Wabes, a gentle boy and star hockey player, disappeared into the cold night. The body of celebrated artist Norval Morrison's grandson Kyle was pulled from a river, as was Curran Strang's. Robin Harper died in her boarding house hallway, and Paul Panichis inexplicably collapsed on his kitchen floor. Reggie Bushy's death was finally prompted an inquest 7 years after the discovery of Jethro Anderson, the first boy whose body was found in the water. Using a sweeping narrative focusing on the lives of the students, award-winning investigative journalist Tanya Talia delves into the history of this small northern city that has come to manifest Canada's long struggle with human rights violations against Indigenous communities. So, if you're interested in looking into some more information about some of the specific ones, like we saw a little bit about some of it in the episode of First Contact where they went up into that area. You've got a couple of interviews down here about these students and the experience that they had, some of which fall into the category of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And you've also got a couple of other links here. So one is this one, right? Which is a documentary about murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is 35 minutes long. Well, that's actually more like 32 minutes long, I guess, once you get into the credits. Okay, so you've got that one. And you've also got this film here, which is called Finding Dawn, which I believe works. It does. All right. So, Finding Dawn, acclaimed Métis filmmaker, if you remember the Métis are people who have mixed ancestry, brings us a compelling documentary that puts a human face on a national tragedy, the epidemic of missing or murdered Indigenous women in Canada. The film takes the journey into the heart of Indigenous women's experience from Vancouver Skid Row down the Highway of Tears in northern BC and onto Saskatoon, where the murders and disappearances of these women remain unsolved. This one is about an hour or so. So what do you do with all this work? Well, we're going to construct what that means right now. So we're going to go assignment. We're going to put, no, not due date. We're going to put it in today's date, which is right here. We're going to call this Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Reflection. Using the attached Google Doc, please reflect on the 2 films attached, discussing the following questions in a short 1 to 2 paragraphs. What have you learned about... All right, so first of all, let's do this. What does stand for? What does this phenomenon mean as a part of Canadian society? What is unfair about the phenomenon of that in Canada? What does it say about our system? What do you think we can do to make it better? Okay, so that's going to be your guiding questions for these films. Okay, I'm just going to add here actually, please make direct reference to at least one of the films and one of the articles attached. Okay, copy, add, create actually, document. All right, just making sure that everybody here gets this. So I'll make it so that everybody can actually do their own thing with this. Okay. Any questions about what this is going to be while the Google Docs takes its sweet time to appear? Okay, so I'm just going to finish getting this deployed into your Google Drives. Okay, there we go. All right, so it should be in your, okay, so it should be in your Google Classrooms now. So enjoy. Again, this is something that, should be completed hopefully once your ISU is in good shape, or if you need a bit of a different approach to the day. It is a bit more work than typical days because there is some watching some films, but I'm hoping that you'll get some pleasure, get some enjoyment out of that. Mr. Begg and I will be around at 1:30 this afternoon. I should warn you that tomorrow's YouTube video will be pre-recorded rather than live. Unfortunately, it's just how it goes sometimes that you have conflicting meetings and all that, and I just want to make sure that it comes out on time tomorrow. So I'm going to pre-record it, but I will be available and around on EDSB messages throughout the day. Okay? So keep the work coming in, keep sending in the EDSB messages, finish up the course strong, and please have a good day. Any questions in the chat, please? All right, seeing no questions, I'm going to start shutting down the stream. So I hope everybody has a good day. Keep up the good work. Keep pushing forward. I know you guys can finish up strong. Okay? Have a good day, everybody.